Welcome to the Norwegian News. With your host, Father Deacon Ananias. I just want to check real quick. How's the audio? I'm not using my earbuds this time. So I just want to get some feedback from you guys before I begin. Audio is good. Apologize. So I've got the whiteboard right here. Oh my gosh, it's backwards. Okay, let's see. I'm not sure I know how to flip the... Let's see if I can get it. It's a bit out of sync. I think so too. Let's see. Is the board okay? Because it's looking backwards on my screen. So is it good on your screen? Perfect. Okay, so what we're going to do today, board is fine, thank you. We are going to go over an argument disproving and refuting materialism via proving that the intellect is actually immaterial. And again, I can bring the board forward a little bit. I was trying to get everything on there so you guys can see it, but it looks a bit small. But anyways, I'll try to make it work. I can give a little bit of an introduction to logic and what we're going to do to make the argument as strong as possible is put them in what we call valid deductive syllogisms. And the deductive argument is defined as if the premises are true, then it's necessarily that the conclusion must be true. In other words, it's impossible, given the structure of a valid argument, that if the premises are true, it would be impossible that the conclusion be false. Now, within logic, you'll see here, let me just move over. There are four figures, figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, and figure 4. And that simply is the arrangement of middle terms within the syllogism. So it's not that important to really grasp that. What is important to know is what these represent. So in logic, an A proposition is simply any proposition that, let me just see this, is a universal affirmative. What that means is a universal is the class that contains all members of a set. For example, dogs. That's a universal. So all dogs is the class or the set that contains all the particular members that we would call dogs. So an affirmative universal statement is all S are P. All dogs are animals is an example of a universal negative. No dogs are, what should we put? Are houses. An I proposition is a particular some S are P. Some dogs are German Shepherds. An O proposition, some dogs are not beagles. Okay. Now the way that we can arrange that within, again, premise, conclusion. The way that you can arrange those propositions either as a universal affirmative negative or a particular affirmative, particular negative, will determine the logical structure of the validity of the argument. Now, that doesn't mean that the argument is going to be true. In order for it to be true, in the strongest sense, you want the structure of that argument to be a valid structure. So if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to. And if you show that the premises are true, then we have something called a sound argument. And a sound argument is simply defined in logic as a valid argument in which the premises of the valid argument are true. So what I've done for you to make this easier is I've listed all the unconditionally valid figures in syllogistic forms. So under the figure 1, we have AAA. That's actually the strongest, in which all universal. For example, all dogs are animals. All animals are living beings. Therefore, all dogs are living beings. EAE, universal negative, universal affirmative, universal negative, would be no one in Hollywood is a Christian. All Christians go to heaven. No one in Hollywood is going to heaven. Turns out it's a valid argument. Okay, I'm just giving you an example of the various things. And again, we have a figure 2, figure 3, and figure 4, and the different arrangements of universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative. So these are the valid arguments. What I'm going to do now is basically, and I'm going to take a modest approach to this. So I can make the argument stronger, but for the sake of my opponent, I'm actually going to give them as much as possible. Now, Aristotle states that in a deductive syllogism, remember, if it's valid, if this premise and this premise are true, it's impossible for that to be false. So if you disagree with an argument, you're going to have to find which premise is false, and then you're going to have to justify that assertion that it's false. If it isn't, then we have demonstrable scientific knowledge that this conclusion is absolutely true. And what's nice about that, as Aristotle points out, you can take that conclusion, which can then become the premise of a further deductive valid syllogism, so on, so that you build a nice case using deductive valid syllogisms to prove your point. So let's just start with some preliminaries. And again, I apologize whether you can see this or not. Let me see if I can pull this forward a little bit. How is it? Is it pretty blurry on the deductive syllogisms there, or can you see it okay? Still kind of blurry. Okay, let's see what I can do here. Don't want to knock this over. Exactly what that is. A little bit better, right? Okay. Towards the edge gets blurry. Yeah, I noticed that too. I wonder if it's the lighting. How about? Is it better? just see if I can pull. Okay, I'm just going to go for it. Remember, when we get to things like in logic, universals or particulars, universal is the set that contains all members of that set. Therefore, again, the class that contains all members, i.e. dogs, would contain every, not only species, but every particular as well. Particulars are individual things. So this dog, Fido, right in front of me, that's a particular. So in logic, that's important to be able to classify whether something's a universal or particular. So with that being said, let's begin. We have the very first deductive syllogism, valid deductive syllogism, is an AEE. So if you look up here on your list of unconditionally valid syllogistic forms, we have a figure 1. Let's see, figure 4. AEE. So that's checked. We've got a valid deductive syllogism right there. So if those premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So let's go for it. We have a universal affirmative. All physical things are particulars. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, any physical thing, like this pen, is a particular pen. In other words, this pen that I'm holding, this marker in my hand, does not represent the class of all markers. It's one marker. So simply translated, that's all that premise means. All physical things that you're going to be able to find in the physical world are always particulars, individuals. E. And this is just definitionally true. No universals are particulars. Nobody's going to object, either with premise 1 or premise 2. The conclusion that follows is a universal negative. No universals are physical things. Now, in order to make this work correctly, so that I can build further unconditionally valid deductive syllogisms, what I've done in logic is called a conversion. A conversion of an E proposition is allowed and is valid within logic. And what a conversion is take the subject and predicate and switch it. And what we will get with an E proposition is an equivalent meaning. And therefore it's allowed. It's a move that's allowed in logic. So let's convert that E proposition that reads no universals are physical things and switch it, the subject with the predicate, so that it now reads no physical things are universals. Now I do that again so that I can get my middle terms to line up in order to have, again, another valid deductive syllogism. And the valid deductive syllogism that I'm going to make is an EIO proposition. Universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. Okay, so let's take the conclusion that was converted, that we know is demonstratively and validly true, from a valid deductive argument, and we're going to take that as our first premise. No physical things are universals. Now, just in case you want to check, we have an EIO syllogism. And if we look up on figure 3, EIO is a valid syllogistic form. So if those premises are true, that conclusion has to be true. So again, let's return back. No physical things are universals. If that's true, we know it. It's impossible for it to be false. An I proposition, some concepts are universals. Now notice that I'm taking a modest approach here. I'm not making this a universal. I'm making it a particular. Some concepts are universals. And again, concepts could be particulars as far as propositional content of a concept. It could be a particular or it could be a universal. So I don't think anybody's going to object to that either. Some concepts are universals. What follows? An O conclusion. Some concepts are not physical things. Okay, are you with me? Just reading some of the chat to see if... Okay. Let's move to the next deductive valid syllogism, which is an OAO. And if we look, that is a figure 3 valid deductive syllogism. OAO, check. What we're going to do again is take the conclusion of the valid deductive syllogism that we just did, because we know that has to be true necessarily. We're going to take that conclusion and we're going to use that as the first premise. Some concepts are not physical things. Premise 2, all concepts are in the mind. Now that's just definitionally true. I don't think anybody's going to say, you know where concepts exist? On the bottom of my shoes because I just stepped in one. Nobody's going to say that. Obviously, concepts are the things that belong in the mind. So I don't think anybody's going to object to that. So again, let's go over this. Some concepts are not physical things. All concepts are in the mind. Therefore, some in the minds, or let's just translate it so it's more intelligible, some things in the mind are not physical things. In other words, to translate that, some things in the mind are not physical. Okay, let's take that conclusion and put it in as the first premise of another valid deductive syllogism and see what happens. This is going to be the same valid figure 3 OAO syllogism, in which case we use the conclusion of our previous demonstratable valid syllogism as the first premise. Some things in the mind are not physical things. Universal affirmative. Premise 2, all things in the mind are part of the mind. Again, I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that. So that things in the mind are obviously part of the mind. So we have another definitionally true premise. But what is the conclusion that follows from that valid deductive figure 3 syllogism? The conclusion that follows is that some part of the mind is not physical. How do we translate that? Well, what does that conclusion mean? In usage, part of the mind is immaterial. Now, some of you might want to know, well, what does immaterial actually mean? Maybe that's not a coherent concept to people. Well, anytime that you see um, un, im, it's a negative prefix in which it's negating that term. So if I say un, and that simply means not intelligible. Therefore, I may not even know the essence of what this is, but I can make a true predication by saying it's not an airplane, it's not a house, and it's not my wife. Okay, so in a similar sense, the notion of immateriality, so whatever universals are as concepts in the mind, what that's saying. And it's taking a mind and it's saying part of the mind is not material, i.e., it is immaterial. But why is that important? Because the materialist or physicalist thesis is this. It's an E proposition. No part of the mind is immaterial. Okay? Because the defeater to materialism and physicalism is that there are things that are not material, i.e. immaterial. Because materialism and physicalism has to hold that all entities, concepts, are material. That's the material thesis. Therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to define the defeater, the counterexample of this. We want to find the logical contradiction of an E proposition. And what I find helpful here is to turn to the modern square of opposition. So I've drawn that up there for you. And what we have here in the upper quadrant is an A. This is supposed to be an E, O, I. Now these on the outside, so the way that E's stand to O propositions and the modern square of opposition is that they're logically undetermined. So we cannot actually determine the truth values between these two propositions. And likewise, each way. So A to E, E to A to I, vice versa, and here. But what we can determine is what is the logical contradiction of an E proposition. You follow along the diagonal, and you find that it's an I proposition. What is the logical contradiction of an A proposition? That, for example, all dogs are animals? It's an O proposition. Some dogs are not animals. That's all you need as a defeater. If you can show that to be true, then you know that this is false. Again, if you want to question the value of the E proposition, i.e. no S or P, or here, no part of the mind is immaterial. In order to defeat that, you have to show that an I proposition, its a logical contradiction, is true. If an I proposition is true, then an E proposition must be false. Remember, if an A proposition is false, then an O must be. So that is basically the way the modern square of opposition works. Okay, let's return to our materialist physicalist thesis. The E proposition, no part of the mind is immaterial. Now, what was it that we established? The contradiction of an E proposition is an I proposition. Some S is P. Well, guess what? This was translated here from an O to an I, so that we have some S is P. Some part of the mind is immaterial. And since we proved that, translating the O proposition to an I, then what we have is the defeater of materialism, the E proposition. So given that this is true, our E proposition must be false, and therefore materialism is refuted by way of showing that at least part of the intellect is in fact immaterial. Okay, so let's see. I hope you enjoyed that. That is something that I've worked out myself, an argument, obviously from teaching logic and thinking about these issues, and just want to see what your feedback is. Let's see here. And again, I'd like to do some other videos too. There's a whole series of arguments that you can use to refute materialism. One of the things, I'm going to go to my bookshelf here. One of the things that I'd like to do for a live stream, again, as some of you had brought up and that I discussed with you, was to talk about philosophy of mind. Now, within philosophy of mind, there are what we call the irreducibility of consciousness arguments. And those are designed to be a refutation of materialism. A very good book as far as an introduction to the philosophy of mind is David Chalmers' Conscious Mind. And in here, he has all the arguments from the irreducibility of consciousness in here. So those are other arguments that I can go over with you as well. Of course, the transcendental argument is another one that we can use to refute materialism. So let me take some of your questions now and see if there's anything you want me to discuss. Okay. Okay, let me take David, David says, yeah, that was my problem with Matt Dillahunty's debate. He claimed he wasn't convinced logic needed foundation, but never demonstrates logic without a mind. It inherently has a foundation. So yeah, let me just explain this. I brought this up in Jay's video. Obviously, this is logic. In the most basic form, you have all S or P, no S or P, these things right here. So that is its propositional form. Now, interesting that what you have here is the verb to be. And when you're making a propositional claim that S is P, or the class of all S are P, guess what? You're in the realm of making veridical claims. What that means is your claim is making a posit about truth, that one thing belongs to another. And this is an act of judgment and predication. Therefore, if you're making acts of judgment or predication, if you're appealing to logic and saying it works, then guess what? You're in the domain of making truth claims. And if you make a truth claim, yes, you cannot just assert a truth claim. You have to provide justification for that truth claim. So Matt is incorrect in that. In his analysis, Matt Dillahunty, that is, his analogy that he used was, look, it just works. Again, the question is that you want to bring up when somebody asserts that it just works. Works for what? Logic just is. Is what? Nobody says of a subject, it simply is. A tree is, because somebody's going to want to know, tree is what? Tree is a plant, tree is a house, tree is green. So that's a nonsensical statement that can neither be true or false. In fact, some things and assertions are terrible, terribly false. But did you know that some things are so bad, they don't even rise to the level of being false? They're meaningless. Saying that logic is not even a false statement. It hasn't even got to that level. It's a meaningless statement because it needs a predicate. If I just say all S are, you're going to think that I'm either having stroke, or you're going to say, look, he's giving verbal diarrhea here. That doesn't make any sense. There's no meaning to that statement. So that's the first thing I say. You need to make complete sentences. Didn't we learn that in grade school? Matt, we need to make complete sentences. Complete your sentence with a predicate. Logic is what? Second of all, if you say logic works, you want to press your opponent and say works for what? When we say something works, what we have is a goal in mind, a telos, an end in which, for example, if I say this pen works, you're going to ask, this pen or marker works for what? I might say, well, it works good for throwing it in my objector's face. Oh, you might respond, well, that's not what markers are meant to do. Well, what are they meant to do? Well, they're meant to write on whiteboards. They're meant to do various things. Throwing them in your opponent's face is not one of them. So again, that you need to press. When somebody presents that sort of objection, you need to press the objector and say, works for what? Now, of course, they'll probably give an answer. Well, it works to give us truth, but then you've got them. If you're in the domain of truth, you're going to have to justify that. You cannot just assert that these things work. Why? We have not established that our minds are capable of perceiving reality correctly. We have not established that logic or even deductive syllogisms or inductive work at all for establishing probability or actually truth. So in an argument, you cannot simply allow your opponent just to assume things without justifying them. So that's what I would say there. I hope that answers. Well, let me just return real quick. Again, they are going to pick a goal. It works for this, and you can also call them out on, well, whatever end or goal that you choose is arbitrary. For example, somebody could say, I built a really amazing bomb and it works. It works for what? It works for the science fair. It works for wiping everybody out. Again, is that something that you want to do, that you ought to do? And so that gets you within the realm of normativity, of which the materialists and atheists cannot account for. We'll go over more of that, but I hope that helps. Let's see here, John Chrysostom. We got my cat. Let's say hello to my. Give him the argument. Okay, he has something. He has something to say. You're allowed to interrupt my lectures. My apologies, but he was just so excited to complete that demonstration for all of you. It will not happen again. Let me return back to, I think John Chrysostom had said something about that the mind is equal to the brain. Again, I'm going to argue later that obviously the mind cannot be reduced either ontologically or epistemically. In other words, the mind can no way be reduced to the brain. You can use some of what's shown in this argument here to demonstrate that. For example, if I'm thinking of a universal, let's just say for the sake of the argument that the universal that I'm thinking of is triangle. A triangle, and I don't mean a particular triangle, like I'm thinking of the triangle here that I just drew up on the board. But the universal is the class of every single triangle. Right angle triangles, isosceles, obtuse triangles, red triangles, blue triangles, 3, 4, 5 triangles, all of them. When I am thinking about triangle as universal, I'm thinking about triangle as the object of my thought as a three-sided geometrical figure, 1, 2, 3, whose sum of angles equals 180 degrees, because that definition captures the essence of a triangle, i.e. the universal, which encapsulates every particular triangle. In other words, that definition, or the essence, in the many. It is what the many all share in common. The many triangles all share in common that they are three-sided geometrical figures whose angles equal 180 degrees. Now, when I think triangle is a universal, where is that located? If you do brain surgery on me, oh God, I hope you don't, but for the sake of the argument, let's say you do brain surgery on me while I'm thinking the universal triangle. Are you going to find triangle in my brain? There it is. I got it. He's thinking it right now. And I see triangle right in his cerebellum. No, it's moved. It's moved to his what is that? The frontal lobe. It's moved to the frontal lobe. You're not going to find triangle. Now, the objection is, well, we'll do MRIs, CAT scans, different things like this, and you'll see when somebody thinks about something, certain regions activated. Well, is a region activated the same thing ontologically and have the same ontological status as a universal triangle? No, clearly it doesn't. The analogy that I like to use, for example, is imagine the brain is a necessary condition, at least in this life, a necessary condition for mental activity like universals and things like that. In other words, what does that mean? I can't have these universals in a normal sense. I can't have these universals and I can't have these thoughts without my brain working. Now, it doesn't mean that my mind is my brain. And the analogy that I would give is, for example, you're driving in a car and you want to go 65 miles per hour. In order for you to go 65 miles per hour, a necessary condition for that is that you have an engine, you have wheels, etc. Now, can you imagine somebody saying that is what 65 miles per hour is? 65 miles per hour is the engine running, and I found it right there in the pistons. That would be absurd. You know that the engine's required in order for you to go 65 miles per hour, but there is no identity between 65 miles per hour and the engine and the pistons running, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can make a similar argument that you cannot reduce mental phenomena like universals to material things. Okay. You might say the brain is a necessary condition for mental, the mental life under normal conditions, allowing for, let's say, abnormal cases, out-of-body experiences, the life after death. But under normal conditions in which we are working within our physical bodies and using our brains, it seems to be that our brain is a necessary condition in order for us to have mental thoughts, because if you take a bat and hit me over the head, guess what? I'm having a hard time thinking about triangles or anything for that matter. Okay, let's see other. If the, let's see, Bolero, the existence of logic presupposes a base, and by base, I take it you mean a foundation, or a mind, how How do we come to the conclusion of a Christian God? Let's see. I don't even think you need to put much of a foundation. So I'm going to some of this so I can draw up this up for you. I'm going to give you a version of the transcendental argument. And what I'm going to argue is that transcendental arguments are the foundation for logic and syllogisms, valid deductive syllogisms. Therefore, the truth of syllogisms, logic, deduction, etc., cannot be dependent upon logic and syllogism. Why? Because that would be circular reasoning. That's the first thing you need to know. When I put this up in the deductive syllogism for you, I'm simply using this as a pedagogical device in which I can make it easier for you to see the logical form of the argument. But the truth of that argument does not depend on the syllogism. Why? Because that would be begging the question. We have not, if somebody wants to know, how do I know logic works for giving us truth? And somebody says, well, let me give you a deductive syllogism. You can't do that because that's what's in question. You cannot use what's in question. Again, I've used this example many times. If I told you everything in David Chalmers' book is true, and you ask me, well, how do you know that? You're not going to allow me to go, well, because I turned on page 151 and it says everything in this book is true. If the book is in question, you cannot use the book to establish the truth of that. That being said, I can still put it into a deductive form in order for you to understand. It goes like this. This is what we call in logic a modus ponens. If P, then Q. So the sideways horseshoe is an if-then. In which case, P is the antecedent and the Q is the consequent. So if P is true, then Q has to be true. Premise one. P, let's do this. 1, 2, conclusion. P then Q, P therefore Q. Now, in logic, the relation between the antecedent and the consequent, and what we call a conditional, stands exactly like this. Antecedent is the sufficient, and the consequent is the necessary condition. And if you want kind of a mnemonic device to remember that, just picture this. Sun. The horseshoe falls over, sun. So that you always can now remember that the antecedent stands to the consequent as the sufficient condition stands to the necessary condition. So let me give you an easy example to illustrate this, and then we can go into a form of the transcendental argument. If I'm ice skating, then I have ice skates. So notice this. Ice skating is a sufficient condition for having ice skates. In other words, it's enough. If I'm ice skating, you know I have ice skates. Well, what are ice skates in relation to ice skating? They're necessary. It's a necessary condition. In other words, in order to ice skate, I have a unique set of affairs or something unique that I must have in order to have that. But just because I have ice skates doesn't mean that I'm automatically ice skating. It's just the bare ingredients. You can't do it without it. That's basically what necessary condition means. It's the bare ingredients of which you can't get this without that. So in other words, if I'm ice skating, I have ice skates. I am ice skating, therefore I have ice skates. That's a modus ponens right there. The valid, as long as these premises are true, this would mean it's impossible for that to be false. So let's look at this. Let's plug in if logic, then some necessary condition Q. Logic exists and works for giving us truth. Therefore, there must be some condition Q. Now, what is going to satisfy as the necessary condition for Q? It must be something unique. And here, what I'm going to do is construct a disjunctive argument to illustrate it. And a disjunctive is an either or. And the way you want to set this up is so that you can make a reductio ad absurdum. Premise 1. Either A, and the little v there stands in logic for or. Either A or B. A tilde means not B, therefore, conclusion, A. Now, that could end up being a fallacy if you're not careful. And that fallacy could be false dilemma. False dilemma is the only thing you can eat is either apples or oranges. Well, that's not true, because you could eat a steak, you could eat bananas. Right? That would only be true if really the only things that were in the room were apples and oranges. Okay. So in order for a disjunctive not to fall into a false dilemma, what you have to show is these are the only two options. This cannot be the case. Not be. Therefore, A must be the case. Now, what are the two options? You got to be careful with this. What are the two options here that we're considering? Well, let's make it general enough that A is either, so A is the theist position, B is the non-theist, the atheist position. That is not a false dilemma, because, again, you could put agnosticism into non-theist. So not believe. Why? Because I put the negation where she's not pregnant. There is no third option, and therefore we avoid the fallacy of false dilemma. What you're going to show is in the non-theist position, accidentalism, that you are not in a position to know. Everything is contingent. Brain are connected in such a way that I can understand logic and get to truth, all the various things. All you have to do is ask the person, how do you determine that? Guess what they're going to do? They're going to use exactly what's in question. Their mind, their faculties, their sense perception to validate and try to justify, well, this is how I know that it works. That is circular reasoning, begging the question. And so what you can immediately know is that that cannot be a conditions, a necessary condition for satisfying and justifying that logic is, it works, and it gives us truth. You're saying, well, what's supporting you? My boots are. Well, what's supporting your boots? I'm pulling them up. You're just going in a circle. So again, the only thing that is going to satisfy the conditions of that is one who is not in the same epistemic quagmire and predicament, one who is a necessary being, one who's omniscient, right? All the classical things that you would say about God, that would be. Okay? Now, that is not the conclusion of a deductive argument, and people always get stumped on this. It cannot be the conclusion of a deductive argument. Don't let somebody force you in there. Why? Because you have not established whether deductive arguments work, whether logic works. And therefore, what you're doing is not a deductive argument and not an inductive argument. You are doing a transcendental argument. A transcendental argument is defined as, given that we hold certain things to be true, we seek to find what are the necessary conditions or presuppositions that must be supposed in order for that thing to be true. So it's about presuppositions. And as you see, you can't just presuppose anything. There's only one candidate that uniquely satisfies the conditions for the possibility of logic. So if you really do hold that logic works, then logic only works if Q, God, logic does work. You assume, therefore God exists. Again, the truth of that is not dependent on this because we haven't even established whether deductive arguments work. Again, in order for deductive arguments to even work, you have to presuppose the necessary conditions for the possibility of any human experience in logic itself. And only God works in that position. You know that now I have guarantee of a lot of things, that nature acts a regular way, that there's identity over time, that I'm not simply restricting my sense impressions and fall into radical skepticism as Hume shows, and that, again, knowledge, science, and morality are possible. Okay. Once you establish that God is the necessary presupposition for that, then you can use a deductive, in this case a modus ponens, to illustrate a logical form. So you have to understand that the truth that God is the necessary presupposition for the possibility depend on a deductive modus ponens or a disjunctive argument. You presuppose God first, then you can validate and justify deductive arguments. Then I can, just like I would draw a triangle, the truth that the area on the sides of a square of a right angle triangle equals the area on the hypotenuse is not dependent upon my picture on the board. But the picture might help you better understand. So that's something that I can do for you there. God is the only necessary presupposition that will operate as the necessary conditions for the possibility of logic, science, morality, etc. We presuppose it. Once you presuppose it and can justify and give warrant to deductive arguments, then I can illustrate it very much the same way that I can illustrate that on a right angle triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I hope that helps. I know this stuff's complicated. Part of it's complicated because we never do these meta-logical analyses. We just assume this stuff works. And remember, as I stated, contra Matt Dillahunty, you can't just assume that it works without proper warrant. You're going to have to justify that. We have justified that, and therefore we can use. So I hope that helps. And again, part of it's just unfamiliarity with transcendental arguments. The more that you study transcendental arguments and the structure, just like you would deductive arguments, you begin to see the power of it. Okay, let's see what else. Issues about whether other gods, and again, these arguments can be developed because I'm not going to just argue any god. Just because you're using the term God doesn't mean that we're referring to the same idea or same entity. For example, well, the atheist will often say, and I think this was Christopher Hitchens' argument, an objection, well, you guys just, the 999 gods out there, you reject all of them and just embrace the Christian God. I just go one step further and make it 1,000. I reject all of them. What we have here is a false analogy. There is no commonality between any of the other pantheon of gods and the Orthodox notion of God, other than this. Now, you might get, again, some similarities that people say he's omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent. That's as far as any similarities that you're going to get. So what I would argue is that we're not talking about the same entity. Why? Because in everybody else, there's a couple arguments that you can make. In everybody else's idea of God, it's something like if you had a grab bag of things in the universe, and the only difference between your grab bag and the atheist was you put the greatest thing that ever could be thought that exists, which is God. And the atheist doesn't have that in their grab bag of things in the universe. Wrong. God is not a thing among other things in the universe on the Orthodox understanding. God is utterly transcendent. God is the very grounds of being. God's not even being. God creates being. So he's not a thing. He's not a ousia. So that eliminates all the rest of the gods. We're not talking about the same thing just because you can put the word God in there. Just like somebody says, this is why it's so important when Christ says, who do you say that I am? You know, everybody has a different Jesus. Jesus may be pronounced Jesus, and it's your name. Really, that's not who we're talking about. Is Jesus the Nestorian Jesus? Is Jesus the monophysite Jesus? All these things make a difference. We're not talking about the same thing just because we're using the same word. And this just goes back to in language, you have sign and thing signified. And the modus significandi, the mode of signification. So words are signs, which are conventional. You can use whatever letters or pictures. Things signified, the reality. And this is the mode of signification. So, for example, when I use the word tree, easily, because it's conventional, we're not concerned about what these letters are. We could do arbor. What is important? That there's a connection in the mode of signification with the thing signified, namely those things. So just because you could use the word tree, one could refer to the thing outside your window, and the other could be, I don't know, let's say you named your car Tree. That's why it's important to say, what do you mean by the word tree? What do you mean by the word God? These, again, in Orthodoxy, this is unique. You will not find this matching to anybody else's word of that. So really, the sign, whether you want to use Deus, Domine, Theos, the word or the sign is not important. It's what it's signifying. And what it's signifying in the Orthodox position is unique. All the other gods are different. And so what you're really doing, Christopher Hitchens, is you're comparing apples with oranges. It's a false analogy. It's a false comparison that cannot be made. Furthermore, so that's the first thing I would say. The orthodox notion of God is unique. And what I argue in my papers, and I argue within the transcendental argument, is that only the orthodox notion of God is unique, satisfies the conditions. It's called ortho God. Satisfies the conditions for the possibility of logic, truth, science, morality. I can go further into you have no contact with. It might be the necessary condition. It might satisfy it, but guess what? You're stuck in the same position that the atheist is. You're not in a position to know because it remains utterly transcendent. So two things you need here. You need the one who is in a position to know, who is not contingent, not stuck in the same epistemic quagmire and predicament that we are in, to become one of us. So why St. John says that the Word was the light of men, is what gives man the ability that the one who is in a position becomes incarnate. So you just ruled out Islam, all the other monotheistic religions, Islam, Judaism. Furthermore, you could rule out all the West because what you also need are the divine energies, because that is the theological means and the experiential means in which you have access to God, outside of his essence, obviously, but in his eternal uncreated activities, in which it provides the means for you to know the necessary conditions. So there might be an idea of God as a necessary condition, but that necessary condition must make itself known, in the incarnation, and the way that you avoid being inconsistent in is with accepting the orthodox notion of divine energies, because that allows you to establish God can be known, and God can be known in this world. Okay, I hope that, again, I can go a lot deeper than this, and it does go much deeper. For those of you interested, I do have a paper on apophatic theology, on the Eastern Orthodox notion of God's essence and energies, and how the transcendental argument relates to that. But as far as an overview, I think that's a sufficient overview for that topic to show, no, none of the other gods are going to work, not even the other monotheistic ideas of God. So I hope that helps. Yes, it can be very long. John Chrysostom. Yeah, that's a good one. John Chrysostom, orthotheos, the correct God. Wonderful term there. I am, are you? Am I what? It works. Works for what? It is what? Last try, Father Deacon. How do you argue against Kant's categorical moral imperative with secular ethics? Very good question. I have a nice lecture on Immanuel Kant. And first thing you have to understand is that in his critique of pure reason, which is an epistemological treatise addressing skepticism, in which he establishes transcendental idealism is the solution to that, you have to understand that his epistemological project is for his moral project. And that sets up for him to do his moral treatise. Now, what Kant's categorical imperative is a universal maxim, because Kant denies that you have any access to what he calls the noumenal world, which is the world in itself. What he has to do from there is establish that, well, let's redefine knowledge in terms of the a priori categories of apperception. And the way that he defines that is the reason why we know things, even though you don't know the world as itself, as long as there's a causal regularity such that the sense manifold, the sensation bombarding you, and I talked about this in Quine's lecture, that the world, the phenomenal world coming from the noumenal world that you don't have access to, you have access to the phenomenal world. But the phenomenal world bombarding your senses is subsumed under the a priori categories of apperception, and under those, the a priori categories of space and time. So what Kant says is that space and time are not out there. They're not extramental realities. They're in here, in the mind. So he says they're not real in the sense of extramental entities or categories. He says they're not objective. So they're not objects out there. They're subjective, but he doesn't mean relative. What does subjective mean? They exist in the subject. In accordance with a rule is a law-like structure for producing predications. So when I say that the tree is green, we don't have a correspondence theory that my proposition or thought that the tree is green is true if and only if it corresponds and matches up to the reality that the tree is green, because you have no access in Kant's philosophy to the noumenal world as itself. So Kant just simply says, who cares? Let's just redefine knowledge in the sense that as long as I'm experiencing that in a law-like way, according to the nature of my mind, such that I can make and justify my predications that the tree is green, that suffices. So you might want to know, well, then how are we all experiencing the same thing if it's all within our mind and subjective? And that's why Kant adds, in accordance with your mind's nature, assuming that there's not something wrong with your mind's nature, assuming that you're not taking copious amounts of alcohol and drugs to alter that nature, which guess what? You will start to perceive reality, space, and time quite differently. Isn't that interesting? But for the sake of the argument, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, if our minds, right, share a similar nature, and under a law-like structure, a law-like is, again, another conditional. If X, then Y. If you see a red light, then you have to stop. One more thing needed in order for something to be law. Not only conditional, if you see the red light, you have to stop. That has to be universal. Of course, you'd think it was absurd if I said, well, that doesn't apply to me. That only applies to you. That's not a law for me. If I see red lights, I get to go through, but you don't. No, a law is if you see a red light, you have to stop universally for all people. So he uses that law-like structure in accordance with the nature of the mind. If sense data, then idea, proposition, predication, whatever you want to put in there. And as long as the nature of the mind isn't altered, that's all you really need, he believes, to get an understanding of knowledge. Well, he's going to use that same formula, that same law-like structure, because he has nothing to appeal out in the real world. He can't appeal to essences because he's embraced the modern project of mechanization of nature, and that with that, the abolition of nature's physis in Greek, forms, eidos, and therefore he has to reconstruct a whole philosophical project. What he does have is mind and law-like structures. So what he's going to do when it comes to ethics is create a categorical imperative. I can put it in a negative format. Never do that which you don't wish is a universal law. So notice I've taken a formula. If you act, you should act in a way that's true for all. And that applies to all. That is a categorical imperative. It sounds similar to the golden rule. A possible objection to that could be, well, what if you're a psychopath? What if you're a masochist, right? Never act in a way that I want everybody else to act. I'd like everybody to, punch me in the face. Therefore, there's my Kant's categorical imperative, worked out perfectly well, and yet you're going to realize somehow that doesn't seem ethical. So that is one objection to it. The other objection to, again, there's two ways that you can err in an argument. You can either err formally or informally in making a logical fallacy, or your students. Remember, that's exactly how reductios work. We assume a false starting point on purpose, get to a contradiction or inconsistency, and then we realize, well, it has to be the other option. Okay? So by process of elimination, the impossibility of the contrary, we know this to be true. This is another way that you can take Kant's starting points are false. There's no reason why we should think this to the noumenal world, or that we shouldn't just, let me put it another way, that we should embrace the modern picture of nature mechanized, that there is no forms in nature, that requires justification. And again, you can transcendental argument on Kant too. You're not in a position to know anything. It doesn't matter how smart you are, even if you're Immanuel Kant. If you then try to, as Kant does, and establish a transcendental argument through his transcendental idealism and transcendental apperception, you're using exactly what's in question to establish what's in question, and that's circular reasoning. So there are three ways that you can attack Kant. One, by a counterexample in which we all agree is absurd. The sadomasochist or the masochistic person that thinks, well, here's my categorical imperative. Okay, that's absurd. That doesn't work. You could critique Kant's presuppositions and starting points. And lastly, you could use a transcendental argument to show that Kant is not in a position to know or state anything until he justifies that he can state or say anything, but he's not in a position to know without the necessary presupposition, which is the orthodox God, the hypostasis, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, so that is a great question. I'm happy you asked that. And I have a more detailed lecture of Kant with slides. I'll try to get that up this semester. Oh! I knew it'd fall. I forgot what I was gonna say. And I erased the board with my hair. I'll get a better setup so I don't knock myself out while I'm giving lectures. unless you want to see that kind of thing. With my own whiteboard. Okay, let's see what other questions you guys have. What is a vicious circle in logic? That's a good. Let me get this set up so it doesn't fall. So we had lots of adventures today. We had my cat trying to disrupt my lecture. We had my whiteboard trying to knock me out, so I could not give you arguments. But as you will see, the Norwegian noose cannot be put down by whiteboards or cats or atheists. And he will keep going until he proves logic is valid and that circular reasoning is not valid. I'm scared of this thing now. Let's see. Woo! Because I wanted to get high enough up so that you guys could see it. So I'm placing some books down at the bottom. But they're sliding. Okay. I feel like it's going to fall again. Okay, let me see here. Are we all good? Suppose you ask the question, is Q true? Maybe I should change Q because then you start thinking of QAnon. Q is not true. I can tell you right now. It is a trap. Is Q true? Yes, somebody says. How do you know that? Why? And then you go to use Q. Q is true because Q is true. Because Q said he's true. This is what's in question. Q. That's what's in question, Q. And what you're doing to prove that is you're using Q to establish that Q is true. So as you notice, that's a vicious circle. You're begging an answer out of the question. And that is not allowed. So again, if Q is logic, is logic true, or does it work for giving us truth? And the atheist says yes. Why? What did Matt Dillahunty say? Because logic, Q, works. That is viciously circled. You cannot use what's in question to establish that what's in question is in fact true. Therefore, you'd be engaged in a vicious circle. Not allowed. So hopefully, I'm really afraid this thing is going to fall down again. There we go. I just need to put it. Okay. Anthony's got a question. Let's see. Oh, I already answered that. Let me go down and see. This is going out the door. You guys really don't need to see a whiteboard, do you? Bam. Some demonic poltergeist dude. Or it's the saints knocking it over, telling me it's my time to end. Or the demons are mad. They don't like the argument. Of course they don't like the argument. You'd rather see the icons. Okay, what other questions do you guys have? Here's a psyop. Yes, it's a psyop. It is a false conspiracy interjected to confuse the masses, distract them. Great comments. Let's turn to this again, just MR. So hopefully I can help you answer this. The Orthodox Church makes lots of statements. True, we do make lots of statements. And are all accepted as true. But there is no proof for many. They are first principles. It's called relation of Catholic consciousness. Okay, we'll try to... Here's what you want to do if there is no proof for them. Just simply bring the question back upon them and ask. The computer just said, your connection is unstable. There's lots of them. It's my internet and my whiteboard. Okay, where was I? If the atheist says, you have no reason to believe in God, you respond back, you have no God to believe in reason. You do not give your opponent the position until they've established it, and they have not established it. So if somebody ever says, well, you don't have any proof for your claims, you have no proof for your proof, and actually our precept, which you rightly point out, MR, is the divine revelation, an apostolic deposit. The faith once delivered to all, to the saints, is exactly what allows us to give proof of proof. So in that sense, no, it's not typically a traditional deductive proof, or it's not an induction, but rather it's a transcendental proof for the possibility of proofs. And therefore, you can say that although it does not fall into the classical notion of either, the traditional kind of notion of deductive, inductive proofs or arguments, it nevertheless is a stronger argument because it provides the necessary conditions for the possibility of arguments, proofs, and demonstrations, and therefore we are justified, because that's really what it comes down to, is justification. Do you have justification for your claims? And what I'm going to argue is no, the atheist, and even outside of orthodoxy, for certain theists, they do not have justification for the claims. So this is a unique position, and it has to be unique so that we don't fall into the fallacy of false dilemma. Or also, you might know that as the false dichotomy. Fallacy of false dichotomy. What other questions do you guys have? Can we compare God in logic to an axiom in equation in mathematics? Would that be valid simplification in comparison to the transcendental argument? Oh, I see what you're saying. Not that God can be expressed in an equation, but is God axiomic? Is he a first principle? Absolutely. And is first of first principles, the most axiomic of all. It must be the starting point for all things.
here's something to think about, because the atheist always takes Christian view and sets this kind of dialectics of opposition between reason and faith. We have reason. Praise be logic. Praise science. And you dummies over there with your blind belief. Now, the orthodox notion of faith is not belief. It's not mere fidelity. We are incarnational in our theology, and therefore faith includes not just the intellect. Otherwise, you're going to end up becoming an Anabaptist and saying you need to have an intellectual faculty and have to pass these courses in order to understand that you're a sinner and receive the believer's baptism. It's ridiculous. That's not what faith means theologically within the realm of the intellect alone, but it incorporates the aspect of the human person. And therefore, what faith is not only trust, but is an orientation towards God, a relation to God with your entire being, your body, soul, mind, and the eyes of your heart, with absolute contingency and trust, the way a little child. That's why Christ says, you must become like one of these little children to enter into the kingdom of God. And what was so apt about that metaphor, that analogy, is that look at the way that children relate to their parents before they develop intellectual capacities, before they develop autonomy and independence. They're completely contingent and trust, not intellectually, not mere fidelity, but with their entire being upon their parents for their livelihood, their very existence. It's completely incarnational. And what Christ is saying is, he's giving us a peek into what faith looks like. You look at the little children and the way they relate to the parents. This is the way man should relate to God, your entire being directed towards theosis, to become like God. And in that is the starting point. That is faith. So let me bring that back around to where I first began, with when the atheist contrasts reason with faith. What I like to show is that reason has as its foundational bedrock, etymologically speaking, faith. How do I know that? Well, guess what? Reason takes faith in its own permanence. What do I mean by that? We say, take something reasonable. Take something simple. 1 + 1 = 2. We hold that not to be a subjective truth, but an objective truth, and by which we mean that the truth value of that is observer or person independent. That it's an objective feature of reality. And that this objective feature of reality is not conventional, although the symbols might be what the symbols signified in the mode of signification. The reality is objective, it's eternal, and it's immutable. I don't think anybody's going to say, well, you know what, we're going to wake up tomorrow and 1 + 1 is going to be 3, and the next day it might be 7 and 9 and square root of 2. If truth had that aspect to it, nothing could be known, nothing could be trusted. So there must be an objective standard of truth by which we measure all things. Now, how do we know that? How does reason determine that 1 + 1 = 2 is going to be true tomorrow, the next day, and the next day? It can't. It's not in a position to know, and it takes faith in the permanence of truth. It takes faith in the permanence of its own faculties and operations that they will work. And again, you can't use reason if it's in question, if you haven't established that, or the faculties of your reason, to validate and show that the faculties of reason work and are reliable. And therefore, what you begin to see is that reason itself takes faith in its own permanence and its own reasonableness. And that faith always undergirds, as an epistemic foundation, reason itself. So the question isn't whether reason takes faith in something. The question is, what does reason take faith in? And does that satisfy as the unique necessary conditions that will justify and give proper epistemic warrant to all the things that we assume that reason just can do? What logic works. My mind my faculties, are such and such. Because we know that, for example, with schizophrenics, that their faculties, their sense organs, and their brain is abnormal relative to the standard population. And therefore we judge they're not apprehending reality correctly. Now, from the vantage point, relatively speaking, that's problematic. If you're not if you haven't established that you can know correctly, noticing that somebody, or noting that somebody else's faculties are different such that they apprehend reality incorrectly, is not a proper justification or argument that they are not apprehending reality correctly. What it can show us, though, is that, well, it's definitely possible that if your faculties aren't, you're not going to definitely apprehend it the way I do, and maybe you're not apprehending reality correctly at all. That analysis and that question should begin to get you to realize that, wow, I'm actually taking a whole lot of faith in the faculties of my reason. That I'm so constructed in such a way that I can perceive reality correctly, that I can formulate judgments, that I can use logic in these various things. And as I've shown, you're not in a position to do that simply by just saying, I'm a believer. I believe in it. I don't need to justify. Why? Because I let logic into my heart and made logic my personal savior. You can't. But what I want to show, though, is that we all take faith in something. Reason takes faith in something. The question then is it taking faith in the right thing? Is it presupposing the correct necessary conditions that would satisfy for the possibility of knowledge and experience of the world? So, great question. Let's see. Is God 3 in 1? This will help. This is a simple formula. You can make checks payable to Father Deacon Ananias for this nice treat that I'm giving you. God is one what? And three who's. Who is God? And God is Father. God is Son. And God is Holy Spirit. So whose refers to hypostasis, person. And they're all one what? One ousia, one nature. What is the Father? Father is divine, God. What is the Son? The Son is divine, eternally begotten, not created, light of light, very God of very God. What is the Holy Spirit? Spirit is God. What is God? Three who's, one what. Notice that we Orthodox here in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Many of you might know what this signifies, and many of you might not know. But here you have the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And in the Son, you have in express, in hypostasis, and hypostasis, the person that God has always been, Jesus Christ. Sorry. What Jesus Christ has always been in his person is divine. But in hypostasis has a human nature. So what we say is that three who's, one what, one God. And in Jesus Christ, fully God and fully man. Completely united, but not confused. So I can make a distinction between those. But the two natures reside in the divine hypostasis of Jesus Christ is divine. So Christ's person is not a human divine person. Christ is, always has been, and ever will be, the divine person, the divine hypostasis that has assumed human nature and the mode of the divine and hypostasis. So I know that's complicated, but these formulas that the fathers have given us, the ways to speak, are very important, because if you don't make these distinctions, as the Holy Fathers know, and as many of you may know, you'll end up falling into, when you carry this out, to heresies. Sabellianism, which is called modalism, Nestorianism, that splits the two natures of Jesus Christ. Monophysitism, in which the human nature is completely subsumed into one divine nature. Okay, that's a heresy. And again, if you don't hold to the words of the fathers spelled out in the councils, like the Council of Chalcedon, and what's clarified thereafter, you will run into heresy. So that's my response to that. The reason why that's important, by the way, that we say that Christ, his hypostasis, his personhood, the Logos is divine, not human, even though it assumes a human nature, is that we're going to have a problem with, it's going to be incommensurate. There's going to be an asymmetry between Christ, the pre-eternal Logos, the divine person, and if you then, after the incarnation, say that, well, when he takes on human nature, his person, his hypostasis, becomes human divine. Do you see? We have two different persons there. Person has been altered. Now, there's one way in which you can say has been altered by taking on. But the fathers are very clear to say it's the person, the hypostasis of Christ, has not altered by taking on the human nature. But human nature exists within the mode of person. The typos, the mode. Why is this important? Because who died, who was crucified, and who resurrected? Okay. When you try to answer that question, is it the same person? No, the person's changed. It's a different person now. If you refuse to call Christ the divine person eternally. Furthermore, in trying to get around that, you're going to end up having to probably commit to some heresy like Nestorianism, that the natures are split. So again, that's why I bring this up. Both Perry Robinson, J. Dyer, Father Peter Heers, many other theologians, and yes, I do call them theologians. They've studied enough. They have a proven track record. They've been trained in philosophy and theology to be able to discuss these things. And they're recognized by the relevant community to be at the level of professional theologians, lay theologians, with the exception of Father Peter Heers, who's obviously clergy. I recommend their work was quite good in spelling this out as far as, and no, it's not called personalism. That's something totally different. By maintaining that Christ is eternally the person, the divine person, is not personalism. All of this spelled great job, so I give credit to him there, and the rest, Jay and them, are all in agreement too. Why? Because they've read the literature, they've read the fathers, they've read the councils, and they've studied it for many years. Okay, this is a question that comes up quite a bit. I'd like to answer. Let's say you believe the Orthodox is the true church. What should a person do if they don't have an Orthodox church near them? Should they go to a different church or just pray at home? Now, I'm assuming that this was the intention to be baptized and be brought into the Orthodox church. It is uncanonical for an Orthodox to attend services outside of the Orthodox church. So if it's really the case that you cannot get, and sometimes people are in weird situations where churches are 2-3 hours away, in which case their liturgical pattern of attending liturgy on Sundays has to change from the normal pattern is what you see in monasticism. It's doing liturgy every day. That's what we're actually the ideal that we're to shoot at. But because we live in the secular world and we have jobs, that's not possible unless we're in a monastery or something like that. And so we adapt our liturgical schedule to fit the other needs in order to live in which God has blessed us. Oftentimes, that has to be switched out even farther than perhaps just once a week. But I would definitely recommend not going to. It would be like this. I don't have an Orthodox church nearby. Can I go pray at a mosque? Can I go to a Jewish temple or synagogue to pray? Can I go see the Lama or in my local Buddhist temple? Can I go see Swami at the Self-Realization Temple and pray? No, these things are important. We have a complete different theology. We have a complete different notion of God. And again, there might be overlaps and similarities. So when you see a Roman Catholic church or a Protestant church, there's going to be things that you see that are similar, and that's going to evoke a sense of the holy within you. And the reason why is because they were attached to the Orthodox church. Not the Protestants, but Protestants is one step removed from reality. Right? The Roman Catholics were part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And breaking away in the schism, they're going to obviously still hold some of the history, right? They haven't done a complete renovation. Not yet. So there's going to be some things that remind you of the sacred and what's valid in the Orthodox Church. Does that mean that you should go to them? No. So again, what I'd encourage you, try to work out something in which every once in a while, as much as you can, but let's say once a month you schedule, let's say it's 3 hours away, once a month you schedule to go to find a church where it has the liturgy. And I'm just giving, an example. It doesn't have to be once a month. between then, and again, people make trips all the time, 3 hours, once a month somewhere, like an amusement park, to go have fun. I think that we can make that sacrifice for God. But whatever your schedule is, your liturgical schedule that you work out, I definitely think that you should contact the priest and explain the situation in which you can work out something that, look, every once or second month, I'm going to try to make it attend, God willing. In the meantime, what I'd suggest is finding live liturgies online on Sunday that, of course, you're not participating in the Eucharist, but you have some form of participation and prayer that you can do. I mean, think about this. St. Mary of Egypt, do you know what her liturgical schedule was? They had to have Father Zosima come out to her, and it wasn't once a month. It was long periods of time in which she was a hermit out in the desert, eating practically nothing, drinking water, and she had to adapt her liturgical schedule. So sometimes that's required. In fact, a lot of the hermits have to do something similar. So that's what I'd recommend. If you're inquiring to Orthodoxy, if you're Orthodox, you're definitely not supposed to be going to it'd be better to pray at home. It'd be better to put the liturgy on and watch a live liturgy. There's many, or even a recorded liturgy. And the reason why is we're protecting from error. So it might seem that we're very similar, but they're preaching different doctrines than us. And those doctrines can seep in and they can change us. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen to a lot of people. So be safe. You don't need to go out of church, have the fullness of faith. Let me see here. I'm just going back up. Looks like you guys are getting in some good chats here. Justin Herschel. Hey, brother. Welcome. Welcome to my humble abode here. Justin quotes John 1:1, assuming John messed up when he said the Logos was God. Was it just John, the evangelist apostle, or did they all? You have to remember that, and I like using the St. Vincentian canon, that we're commanded to hold, to believe and practice what has always been believed everywhere at all times. That is exactly what the apostolic deposit of faith is. And assuming that Christ had delivered the faith to the saints once for all, in its entirety. So we don't need a Catholic doctrine of, let me see if I can find my John Henry Newman on Christian development. We don't need to develop our doctrine. We have it in entirety, which is exactly what the word Catholicity means. That is wonderful, because when you hear something new that wasn't always believed everywhere at all times, guess what? You know it's an innovation. Now, if John was really preaching something that Christ had not taught, and there were people in history that did teach things that the apostles did not receive from Christ, which the apostles did not preach. Guess what? You have the fathers, you have the saints, you have the people in the church immediately rise up and condemn it. And it's written down. There's synods, there's councils, there's letters going back and forth. So you're going to have to ask, this is really interesting. If John is making up some new doctrine that Christ didn't teach, why are not the rest of the apostles saying anything? Why is not the rest of the Christian community saying anything? Why is it, on the contrary, all the apostles and their disciples are all preaching the exact same thing? And it's because that's exactly what Christ taught. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And the Father in one. Again, if you're going to use the apostles, or if you're going to use the Bible to show that some Orthodox doctrine is incorrect or one of the apostles is incorrect, you're going to be caught in circular reasoning. Why? Because you're using the Bible, right? The document. Where are you getting your information from to say that this is wrong and this is correct? The Bible was composed by the Orthodox Church. Why? Because there were spurious texts out there under the banner of being not only true, but apostolic. Oh, there weren't people walking around with a Bible in their hand in the first century. It was not compiled. So, how did they know which books were apostolic and which ones were true? Just as I expressed in the St. Vincentian canon. Because canon, or rule, the standard, was beware of false doctrines. Remember, Paul states this. And strange teachings. St. Vincentian formula states, therefore hold to what has always been practiced, preached everywhere at all times. And that's exactly when we're looking at these different ideas. We've never heard this new idea that Christ is not God. Who told you that? Who told you Christ wasn't? Where did you get that information? Never heard that. This is a strange false doctrine. It wasn't preached by the apostles, their disciples, their disciples. And in fact, when people did preach that, namely Arians, guess what? You have the church, the disciples of the disciples, going back to the apostles who received from Christ, speak up and condemn that is a heresy, that Christ is God. He is divine. So I hope that answers your question. And it's not polytheistic. Many gods is what polytheism means. Theos in Greek means God. Poly means many. Where in Christian doctrine does it say we worship many gods? Because we have three names of three persons? What did we say? Those three persons are all one what? One God, not many God. That should be a fairly easy. But again, you're going to get these sort of objections from Islam, the Mohammedans, because they're committed to absolute divine simplicity too, that they cannot make any distinctions within the nature of God. And therefore, they do not have the conceptual categories to be able to go through this. You know, there's an interesting story that after the fall of communism, many people went to the post-communist countries and states as translators and trying to translate certain ideas, works, stuff like that, texts. And they came across something really interesting. They came across certain translational problems where they're unable to translate certain things that were related to a specific concept or word. they were unable to translate. And what that concept, what those words were, is anything associated with individuality. Why? Because that reality did not exist under communism. There was no I in those states. Therefore, they did not have the conceptual categories to even understand what the translators were saying. There was no reality. And it's the same with paradigms as well. If you're locked in a certain paradigm that's devoid of certain realities, you're going to be lacking and deficient in certain conceptual apparatus in which you can process and make these distinctions. And therefore, this is why the Mohammedans constantly claim errors, right? They're committed to a paradigm in which God is utterly transcendent, right? In no way, other than somehow strangely becomes incarnate in a book. It becomes the literal words, a word of God, which is paradoxical. But setting that aside, they hold to an absolute divine simplicity that enters in no way into nature, and no distinctions can be known, and nothing really can be known about God whatsoever. They have limited themselves and their conceptual apparatus in order to be able to properly think through these things. That's why I keep hammering home the point. What are your starting points? People are starting from false axioms, false starting points. And when you do, problems arise. You make errors in argumentation. You're unable to see certain things. I know this from my own experience, maybe many of you who have converted, that when reading scripture in the Bible, I continually come across things that I'd never seen before. I've read the Bible from back many times, and yet I'll come across something I'm like, I've never seen that in my life. Or you read a passage and it's entirely different. I had no idea that it meant that. That happened. That happens because of your paradigm and your conceptual lenses. They can either limit you or they can open that. And who opens it? It's the church that opens that, the Orthodox Church. This is why when you go to the story of the Ethiopian eunuch reading the prophet Isaiah, and St. Philip the apostle is miraculously transported to the eunuch and says to the eunuch, "Understandest thou what thou readest?" What does the eunuch say? Ethiopian eunuch says, "How can I unless I'm provided an interpreter?" Who is the interpreter? Well, when you look at the book, the Apocalypse of John, the Revelation, you have in, I believe it's, chapter 4? You have in the lineage of David, the one who brings the keys. And you have other passages in Revelation as well that talks about there was no one that was able to open the scrolls. Who could read and understand this? And then what you get is the image of Christ coming in. Christ is the one who can open the scrolls. Christ is the one that has the keys. And Christ opens that in order that the scriptures can be understood through the interpreter. Now, where is that? That is in the divine liturgy. Those are the keys. That is where Christ is. And there is Christ is opening the scriptures, and we actually read the scriptures. And the whole liturgy from beginning to end is the opening up of the kingdom of heaven, right? Leaving away these false paradigms in which we're blinded and we can't see. It's only in the Orthodox Church, in the context of the liturgy, surrounded by all the saints, in which, and I can talk about this later, you experience kairotic time. which is different than chronological time, coming from the Greek word chronos, one after another, in which past, present, and future are all distinct separations within time. Kairotic time is not quantitative, but qualitative. And just as in chronological time, clearly you couldn't have present and future existing at the same point. In kairotic time, present and future can exist at the same point and always do. And this is why we say in the Divine Liturgy, when I begin the liturgy, I turn to the main concelebrant, the priest, and I say it's time for the Lord to act. And the word is kairos. It's not because it's 10 o'clock and we've got to get the liturgy started. What that is a pronouncement and a petition to the Lord, bring down eternity, bring down the kingdom of heaven to earth, where the infinite intersects the finite, and the kingdom of heaven, which is both past, present, and future, is brought into one point in this finite world. And here you get to experience the eschaton, the end age in the present. The unfolding of the scrolls takes place in the liturgy, and you get to have a foretaste of the kingdom to come in the present now, and truly experience that in an incarnational way. And again, that's all to hammer out and go back to the idea, what is your reason taking faith in? What is your paradigm? There's only one paradigm that works, and there's only one person who's in a position to know, and only one person that has the keys and can open the scrolls. And we're able to see that and understand the faith delivered to us, both by word of mouth, oral tradition, and epistle, the written scriptures. So I hope that clarifies a bit. Again, these are wonderful questions. I do appreciate. Yes, logos is not an attribute, but as a person. There's this beautiful exchange between St. Augustine and St. Ambrose. Before Augustine converts to Christianity and he's brought into Carthage, when he's living in Carthage, was it Carthage? Milan, excuse me. Augustine was in Carthage, but he was brought to Milan because Ambrose was the bishop of Milan. And Augustine's brought in is the imperial orator. And he encounters St. Ambrose there, who's objecting to Rome's destruction and persecution of the churches and the Christians. And of course, it's Augustine's chance to show off his fine philosophical skills, rhetoric, and his oratory skills. And he goes toe-to-toe with the great Ambrose. They have a conversation, but much similar to the conversation that Christ and Pontius Pilate have about truth. Quid est veritas? Pontius Pilate says to Christ. His response is mirrored in Ambrose's response to Augustine, because Augustine begins to give a philosophical account of what truth is, and Ambrose stops Augustine. Says, Augustine, stop. Truth is not an idea. Truth is a person. And for the very first time in Augustine's life, he's silenced. He's silenced not by philosophy, he's silenced by a person. And the most beautiful thing is the actus of the Theotokos, the Mother of God, in which you will receive this line when you read it. She makes philosophers as mute as fish. The words that St. Ambrose was speaking were not his own words. They were not philosophy. It was the incarnation of the Logos itself speaking through Ambrose. And it was exactly what silenced the greatest of philosophers at that time. And so we must remain committed to the idea, as the apostles and the church fathers were, as Paul was on Mars Hill, when he said to the unknown God, we know this. For the Greeks conceived of logos as an impersonal force or an idea, the ratio, the account, the reason, but it was abstract and personal. And what was revealed to us is that the Logos was not only God, and with God, and all things were created through the Logos was God, and the Logos became one of us and took on human nature in order that he may become the light of men that shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehends it not, which is exactly what we see. So it's very important. The Logos is a person, and eternally the divine person, the hypostasis, the second person of the Holy Trinity. So I hope that helps. And in that sense, you're absolutely right. Who wrote this right here? Justin Herschel. He was the mediator between God and man, in many different senses, but in that sense too, that we just spoke about. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. And my antics, the board falling on my head, my cat's jumping around. Next stream, I'll light this whole place on fire, and you can watch me burn this down if you want. I'll take suggestions. Do you want it on fire? Do you want me to blow it up? Do you want me to flood the apartment? The bookshelf to fall on me, right? This is how we make philosophy and theology entertaining, right? Otherwise, we might not have people in the chat, right? That's exactly. Let's see. Any suggestions? Mauled by Lions, reenactment of the first century persecutions, the Diocletian persecutions. How much are you charging us, Father, for the lecture? You are charged with, you must go get baptized, Orthodox now, and do prayers and feed the poor and be kind and love your neighbor as yourself. God with all your heart, mind, and soul. That's what I'm charging. And guess what? That's what I'm selling too. Just 2 hours of your life. That's good. And if you haven't liked and subscribed, please do. You guys have been great. My subs have been, especially, I've got to give a shout out to Jay for helping me out. My subs went from like 97 to, so I probably went to like 100 now or something like that within 3 days. I need 2,000 before I can start generating income. Maybe that's not that far off. You guys remember the Bible verse? What is impossible with man is possible with God. So pray for me, Deacon Ananias, the sinner. I need your prayers. I love your feedback. And I hope you guys have a blessed day. Labor Day. So go out and labor. Let's see. And hopefully I'll have another stream up for you shortly. So God bless you, keep you, and let his face shine upon you. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon us and save us all. Amen.